When we imagine soldiers from the past marching off to war, it is easy to picture gleaming swords, sturdy shields, and maybe a loyal horse. Yet history tells us that the life of a soldier was far more complicated than polished armor and sharpened steel. Armies throughout the ancient world carried not only their weapons, but also a wide range of unusual, sometimes bizarre items that modern eyes might find puzzling. Some of these objects were practical, serving as tools for survival when campaigns dragged on for weeks or months. Others were deeply symbolic, woven into the spiritual fabric of the time, meant to protect warriors from harm or grant them courage. And still others, surprisingly, were personal comforts, reminders of home or even superstitions that gave soldiers a sense of control in the chaos of battle. From charms crafted by priests to foods preserved in strange ways, from animals carried as mascots to bizarre medical remedies tucked into packs, the soldiers of the past bore much more than simple instruments of war. In fact, when we look closely at the odd things they brought with them, we begin to see the very human side of warfare: fear, hope, faith, and the desperate wish to return alive. Tonight we will walk through time, traveling from ancient Mesopotamia to Rome, from the Greek phalanx to far-flung armies of the East, and explore the fascinating, often overlooked things that soldiers carried into battle. Section 1. The protective power of amulets and charms. One of the most consistent oddities found in the packs and pockets of ancient soldiers was not a blade, but something far smaller: the amulet or charm. Long before science offered explanations for disease, injury, or survival, people relied on symbols and sacred objects to shield them from harm. Soldiers were no exception. In ancient Egypt, for example, soldiers often wore amulets in the shape of the Eye of Horus, a sacred symbol believed to guard against evil and restore health. Crafted from lapis lazuli, faience, or even simple clay, these charms were lightweight and easy to carry. To the Egyptians, these were not mere decorations. Each symbol was infused with divine power, ritually blessed by priests before it was tied around the soldier's neck or sewn into clothing. Going into battle without one might have felt as reckless as leaving behind one's shield. Mesopotamian soldiers also had their own protective talismans. Clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform prayers were sometimes worn in small leather pouches. The texts invoked gods like Ninurta, a warrior deity, or Shamash, the sun god who saw all things and was thought to strike down liars and evildoers. These were meant not just as tokens, but as actual contracts with the gods. Reminders that divine eyes watched over the soldier, perhaps tipping the balance of fate. In Greece, hoplites carried small charms linked to the gods of Olympus. A sprig of laurel, sacred to Apollo, or a miniature figure of Athena, carved in bronze, might be worn. Roman soldiers adopted this tradition too, often carrying phallic amulets called fascina, believed to ward off evil spirits. It might seem strange to us today, but to a Roman soldier, the symbol of fertility was also a symbol of strength, virility, and life force, qualities every warrior wanted on his side. Even more curious were the magical texts known as curse tablets, carried by some soldiers in the Roman legions. These thin sheets of lead, inscribed with tiny, cramped writing, might include invocations asking the gods to weaken or curse the enemy. Imagine marching into battle with such a tablet in your pack. Believing the very words engraved in metal would sap your foe's courage before the fighting began. Outside the Mediterranean, similar practices flourished. In China, soldiers during the Han Dynasty sometimes wore small jade pendants. Jade was thought to hold a purifying energy, ensuring that even if a soldier died, his spirit would remain whole and protected. In India, warriors tied red threads around their wrists, often blessed by priests, meant to guard them from both arrows and misfortune. What makes these amulets and charms so fascinating is how universal they were. No matter the culture, soldiers craved something to protect them beyond their armor. Armor could be pierced, shields could be broken, but faith in an object's power, that was invisible armor, a kind of spiritual shield no enemy could see. Think about the emotional comfort these small objects must have provided. A soldier, standing in the moments before battle, may have touched his charm, whispered a prayer, and felt, if only briefly, less alone. The noise of war might roar around him, but in his hand was a link to his gods, his home, his family. It was a reminder that his life mattered and that forces larger than himself might intervene on his behalf. Of course, some might dismiss these talismans as superstition, and indeed, they did not physically deflect an arrow or stop a sword. Yet, in their own way, they worked. They calmed the mind, they steadied the hand, and they gave men a sense of control over the uncontrollable. Even today, modern soldiers carry tokens of home, photographs, lucky coins, or small gifts. The impulse is the same. So the first odd item on our journey is not odd at all when you think about it. Soldiers carried charms and amulets because they carried fear. And where fear exists, people will always seek protection, whether from gods, fate, or the mysterious power of a small object pressed close to the heart. Section 2. Strange Foods and Rations of Ancient Soldiers. When armies set out on campaign in the ancient world, one of their greatest challenges was not only the enemy they would face, but how to feed themselves along the way. Unlike today, where logistics and supply chains can transport rations across oceans, ancient soldiers often had to march with whatever they could carry, and what they brought was sometimes unexpected, sometimes bizarre, and always telling of their culture. Let us start with the Roman legions, perhaps the most famous professional army of antiquity. Roman soldiers were known to carry hardtack-like biscuits called bucculatum. Hard, dry, almost inedible without soaking. These biscuits could last months without spoiling. But what is odd is that legionaries sometimes ground them back into flour when desperate, using water and oil to make a rough porridge. Alongside this, they often carried a lump of cheese, dried fruits, and a measure of vinegar diluted with water, known as posca. To modern ears, vinegar water sounds more like cleaning solution than refreshment, but legionaries swore by it. It kept water safe to drink, cut thirst in hot climates, and gave a sour tang that felt strangely energizing. Meanwhile, Greek hoplites carried something much simpler, a pouch of barley flour. Soldiers mixed it with water, wine, or even animal fat to create a quick meal called maza. What makes this strange is how unflavored it was, essentially a paste that could be eaten on the march. Yet, for a Greek soldier, it was more than fuel. Barley was tied to the goddess Demeter, and consuming it in the field connected the warrior to the agricultural roots of his homeland. In Mesopotamia, soldiers of early empires like Assyria often carried dried fish and beer tablets, compressed forms of grain that could be dissolved in water to create a crude brew. Beer, after all, was safer to drink than stagnant water. What is unusual is that they sometimes brought with them small sacks of onions and garlic, considered almost medicinal. These pungent foods were believed to strengthen the body, ward off illness, and even give courage. Imagine soldiers munching on raw garlic before battle, both for nourishment and as a spiritual tonic. Further east, Chinese soldiers during the Han Dynasty had their own peculiar ration. They carried blocks of compressed tea leaves, which could be crumbled into boiling water. Tea was not just a drink, but also medicine, believed to clear the mind and sharpen focus. Alongside it, they often packed salted plums, whose sourness stimulated thirst and encouraged soldiers to drink more water on long marches. To modern taste buds, salted plums might feel odd, but to the Han soldier, they were both a comfort food and a survival trick. In Northern Europe, Celtic warriors were known for carrying curiously prepared animal parts. Archaeological evidence suggests that some carried dried boar meat or smoked horseflesh, packed tightly for long campaigns. They also carried caudle, a strange mixture of milk, honey, and oatmeal, which could be drunk warm or cold. What makes it fascinating is that caudle wasn't just fuel, it was tied to ritual. Drinking it before battle was meant to bring unity among warriors, almost like a sacred toast before the fight. Even more surprising are the accounts of Aztec warriors in the Americas, who relied heavily on dried tortillas and chia seeds carried in small pouches. Chia, when mixed with water, expands into a gel, offering quick energy. It was so powerful that some Spanish chroniclers later described it as magical endurance food. Alongside it, Aztec soldiers carried cacao beans, not only to consume, but also as currency. In fact, a warrior might march into battle with his wealth tied up in beans, able to buy food or favors along the way. But some ancient soldier foods were downright bizarre. Take the Mongols, for instance, who carried dried curds called arul. These were rock-hard chunks of fermented milk, so tough that they could break teeth if eaten raw. Soldiers often softened them by sucking on them for hours as they rode. Mongol horsemen also performed something shocking to outsiders. In dire times, they would nick a vein in their horse's neck and drink the blood mixed with milk. It sounds grotesque, yet it allowed both man and animal to survive without supplies for days on the vast steppes. Equally odd were the foods of Viking raiders. They carried dried fish, smoked meats, and a peculiar mixture known as skyr, a fermented dairy product somewhere between cheese and yogurt. Skyr was rich in protein and lasted for months. Yet alongside it, Vikings sometimes carried mead, a honey-based alcohol. To us, it might seem impractical to bring alcohol into battle, but to them, mead was both a morale booster and a ritual substance tied to their gods. Drinking it before combat connected them to Odin, the god of war and wisdom. The common thread in all these strange foods is not simply survival, but culture. Each item a soldier carried was tied to his homeland, his beliefs, and his way of life. A Roman drinking sour vinegar water, a Mongol sucking on rock-hard cheese, or a Celtic warrior sharing oat milk with his brothers, each of these acts reveals not only how armies survived, but also how they found comfort and identity far from home. It is easy to underestimate the role of food in war, but without these strange rations, campaigns would have collapsed. Armies march on their stomachs, as the old saying goes, and what they carried was as crucial as their weapons. And in many ways, these foods were more than fuel. They were reminders of family, tradition, and the rituals of home. Section 3. Animals in Armor. Unusual companions in ancient warfare. When we think of ancient soldiers preparing for battle, we imagine swords, shields, and armor. Yet in many armies across the world, Soldiers also carried something less obvious, but no less important: animals. From loyal pets to ritual creatures, from beasts of burden to symbols of the divine, animals accompanied men into war in some of the strangest and most unexpected ways. Let us begin with the Romans, who were famously practical, but also deeply symbolic. Roman soldiers sometimes marched with dogs, not only for protection, but also as mascots. The Molossian hound, a massive and fearsome breed, was trained to wear armor fitted with spikes. These dogs could terrify enemies and even charge into battle alongside the legionaries. Yet on the softer side, smaller dogs were also kept as companions in the camps. Archaeologists have uncovered tiny dog collars and remains in Roman forts, suggesting soldiers formed bonds with these creatures, carrying a piece of home with them on long campaigns. In Greece, soldiers too were known to bring animals, but here the emphasis leaned toward symbolism. Roosters, for example, were sometimes carried into battle. Why? Because the rooster was seen as a creature of courage and vigilance. Its crowing at dawn reminded warriors of new beginnings, of light overcoming darkness. To have a rooster in camp was to have a living emblem of bravery, and some warriors even believed the bird's presence could tip the favor of the gods. Imagine the chaos of a camp at night, with roosters crowing in the darkness, their cries echoing across the tents like strange war horns. Travel eastward, and in Persia, horses were revered to such an extent that they became almost sacred. Soldiers did not merely ride horses. They carried with them the belief that the horse was a divine gift, a companion blessed by the gods. In the Achaemenid Empire, it was not unusual for warriors to perform small rituals with their horses before combat, tying ribbons or charms into their manes. Some records even suggest that particular horses, thought to be favored by the gods, were never ridden in battle, but brought along as living symbols of protection. Further afield, in Egypt, animals carried even deeper religious meanings. Cats, sacred to the goddess Bastet, were sometimes brought into military camps. Killing a cat, even accidentally, was a crime punishable by death, so soldiers treated them with extreme care. Cats were believed to bring protection and ward off evil. They also had a practical role, keeping granaries free from vermin. Some Egyptian soldiers may have seen the cat not only as a guardian of food, but as a talisman of divine favor. There are even stories of Egyptian armies releasing cats into enemy lines, knowing their opponents feared harming them. The Celts of northern Europe also had unusual animal companions. They revered wild boars, animals associated with ferocity and strength. Warriors sometimes carried carved boar figurines or even live boars into camp, believing the animal's spirit would lend them courage. In battle, the Celts would adorn themselves with boar symbols on helmets and shields. But the presence of a live animal near the warriors made the connection even more visceral. And then, there were animals that were less symbolic and more practical, though still odd to modern sensibilities. The Mongols, for example, carried not only horses, but also sheep and goats alongside their armies. These animals served as both food supply and living larders. Soldiers could milk them, shear them, or eat them as needed, keeping their army moving without the need for large supply wagons. To the Mongols, animals were living provisions, loyal and endlessly useful. In Mesoamerica, the Aztec warriors are known to have brought along turkeys and dogs called Xoloitzcuintli. These dogs were not battle animals, but they had ritual importance. They were believed to guide souls into the afterlife, and bringing them into war symbolized spiritual preparation for death. To carry such an animal was not only to prepare for combat, but also to acknowledge the possibility of dying honorably. Even more peculiar are the animals used in intimidation. Indian war elephants are well known, towering beasts that carried soldiers and crushed enemy lines. But less commonly noted is that soldiers sometimes decorated these elephants with brightly colored paints and jewels, turning them into living symbols of divine power. For an enemy army, to see an elephant covered in gold and paint must have been both terrifying and surreal. Similarly, in Southeast Asia, monkeys and parrots were sometimes brought to camps, their chatter and cries adding a strange, almost supernatural layer to the sounds of war. And in the medieval continuation of ancient traditions, falcons and hawks were occasionally carried by noble warriors. These birds of prey were not for war, but for status. To carry a falcon into battle was a statement that a man was of noble birth, wealthy, and favored by fortune. Such birds were sometimes released ceremonially before a battle began, soaring high above the field as omens. What unites all these examples is the human tendency to see animals not just as creatures, but as companions, symbols, and spiritual allies. For the ancient soldier, carrying a dog, a rooster, a horse blessed by the gods, or even a sacred cat, was more than practicality. It was a way of bridging the natural and divine, of making the chaotic world of war feel more secure. To us, the idea of marching into battle with a rooster under one arm or a cat prowling through the camp might sound absurd. But for those who lived in times when the gods and spirits were thought to walk alongside men, these animals were more than pets. They were guardians, messengers, and sometimes even silent warriors themselves. Section 4. Charms, amulets, and the power of superstition. For the ancient soldier, no shield felt truly strong enough, no sword truly sharp enough, unless he carried something else, something small, intimate, and often hidden. These were not weapons or tools, but charms and amulets, objects believed to carry luck, power, or the favor of the gods. In times when battle could be brutal and unpredictable, such items offered soldiers a sense of control, a promise that unseen forces might guard them when steel and skill could not. Let us begin in ancient Rome, where soldiers often wore small amulets called bulla. Traditionally, Roman children were given a bulla at birth, a small pouch containing protective charms, and some carried these into adulthood, even into war. A soldier's bulla might contain bits of herbs, inscribed words, or even tiny carvings of deities like Mars, the god of war, or Fortuna, the goddess of luck. Some also wore phallic charms, symbols thought to ward off evil and bring vitality. Archaeologists have found these tiny bronze or bone carvings at Roman sites, suggesting they were carried into battle like invisible armor. Across the Mediterranean in ancient Greece, soldiers turned to amulets as well. A hoplite might wear a pendant inscribed with protective symbols, or carry a small object dedicated to Athena, goddess of wisdom and war. Some amulets were carved with what were known as apotropaic designs, symbols meant to frighten away evil spirits. The Gorgonean, a medallion with the terrifying face of Medusa, was one such example. To a Greek soldier, strapping a Gorgon's face to his chest or shield wasn't just decoration. It was a magical weapon in its own right, meant to freeze enemies and spirits alike. Moving to Egypt, we find perhaps the richest tradition of protective charms. Egyptian soldiers often carried amulets shaped like scarabs, sacred beetles symbolizing rebirth and eternal life. These small objects, carved from stone or molded from faience, were believed to ensure that even if a soldier died in battle, his soul would be renewed in the afterlife. Others carried the ankh, the cross-like symbol of life, or tiny representations of the Eye of Horus, a powerful emblem of protection. In battle, these objects gave courage. In death, they promised safe passage to the beyond. Some soldiers even tucked them under their armor, pressed close against their skin, as if to draw their power directly into their bodies. In Mesopotamia, the cradle of some of the earliest organized armies, soldiers turned to magic as much as to metal. Clay tablets inscribed with protective incantations were sometimes carried into battle. Others wore small figurines of demons or gods, paradoxically using fierce supernatural beings to guard them against harm. Amulets shaped like lions' heads, for instance, symbolized courage, while those carved with cuneiform spells were believed to physically repel arrows or blades. For these warriors, writing itself had power. The act of inscribing words on clay was as much a weapon as the spear in hand. The Celts of northern Europe were known for their reverence of natural objects as charms. Soldiers often carried small stones, bones, or pieces of wood believed to hold magical strength. Some wore amulets shaped like boars, stags, or ravens, animals tied to their gods and warlike qualities. Others believed in the power of certain plants. Mistletoe, harvested by druids with great ceremony, was thought to bring invulnerability. Warriors might tie sprigs of it to their clothing or tuck it inside their belts. To them, the forest itself marched with them into battle. Meanwhile, in India, warriors carried talismans blessed by priests and tied around their necks or arms. These often contained written verses from sacred texts or symbols painted in saffron and ash. Some soldiers believed such charms could deflect arrows, much like a shield of divine light. In fact, accounts survive of warriors stepping into combat, fully convinced that their amulet rendered them untouchable. Whether true or not, such belief undoubtedly gave them courage, sometimes the most powerful weapon of all. In China, soldiers also leaned heavily on the power of amulets. Coins with square holes, tied together with red cords, were thought to bring good fortune and protection. Soldiers sometimes sewed these into their garments, or tied them around their weapons so that each strike was guided by luck. Some carried jade pendants, as jade was believed to embody purity, strength, and even immortality. Others wore small charms shaped like tigers or dragons, hoping to channel the ferocity and strength of those creatures on the battlefield. One of the more unusual traditions comes from the Norse warriors of Scandinavia. Vikings often wore small hammer-shaped amulets representing Mjolnir, the hammer of Thor, god of thunder. To carry Thor's hammer into battle was to carry his strength and protection, a reminder that storms and lightning themselves were on the side of the warrior. Some even carved runes onto stones, bones, or weapons, believing that these inscriptions carried magical power. To a Viking, a blade marked with runes was not just steel, it was enchanted, humming with unseen force. What is fascinating is how similar these practices were across different cultures, despite their distance. Whether it was a Roman bulla, an Egyptian scarab, a Celtic stone, or a Norse hammer, soldiers everywhere clung to the idea that small objects could influence vast battles. These amulets were intensely personal, often worn close to the heart or tucked into armor where no one else could see. For some, it was a connection to family, a charm given by a mother, a lover, or a priest. For others, it was a pact with the divine. The power of these charms wasn't necessarily in their physical properties, but in the belief behind them. In a world where death could arrive suddenly and brutally, a soldier who believed he was protected by the gods fought with more confidence. And sometimes, confidence itself was the difference between survival and defeat. To modern eyes, a pocket filled with herbs, stones, or strange trinkets may seem odd, even childish. But for the soldier who carried them, these objects were anchors of hope, proof that even in the heart of chaos, something greater watched over him. Section 5. Strange foods and drinks for battle. When we think of ancient soldiers preparing for battle, we often picture weapons, shields, and armor. But survival on the battlefield required more than just strength and steel. It also demanded sustenance. Food and drink were as vital as swords and spears, for hunger and thirst could defeat an army faster than any enemy. Yet the rations soldiers carried into battle were often strange to modern eyes. Some were unusual in their simplicity, others in their extravagance, and still others in their sheer oddness. Each culture, shaped by geography, religion, and tradition, developed its own way of fueling its warriors. Let us start in ancient Rome, where soldiers marched with bread at the heart of their diet. Known as buccellatum, this was a hard, dry biscuit made of wheat flour, baked until it was nearly rock-like. Soldiers carried these biscuits in their packs, sometimes softened with water, wine, or even vinegar. Alongside it, they often carried dried cheese, salted pork, or beans. But one of the strangest additions was pasca, a drink made by mixing sour wine vinegar with water. To us, it might sound unpleasant, but Roman soldiers swore by it. It was refreshing, killed bacteria in water, and even gave a bit of energy during long marches. Pasca was considered so vital that commanders themselves often drank it alongside their men. The Greek hoplites relied heavily on dried figs and olives, compact sources of energy that could be carried easily. But they also had a peculiar love for kykeon, a drink made of water, barley, and sometimes herbs like pennyroyal or even cheese. This mixture was both nourishing and filling, though modern palates might find it bizarre. Some historians even suggest that certain versions of kykeon had mild hallucinogenic properties, meaning Greek soldiers might have entered battle with not just energy, but altered states of mind. The Egyptian armies also carried unusual supplies. Bread was again central, but theirs often contained additions like onions and garlic, both of which were believed to provide strength and ward off illness. In fact, garlic was considered so essential that it was almost a soldier's medicine as much as food. Dried fish from the Nile was also common, wrapped tightly for preservation. One strange element of their rations was beer, not a light drink, but a thick, porridge-like beer that could be both eaten and drunk. Soldiers relied on this as a staple source of nutrition, and it became so intertwined with Egyptian life that even soldiers' wages were sometimes paid in beer. In Mesopotamia, the cradle of agriculture, soldiers often carried small cakes made from dates and barley. Dates were considered almost magical, a fruit tied to fertility, life, and energy. Packed with sugar, they were the perfect marching ration. Some also carried dried locusts, roasted and salted, a protein source that might seem odd today, but was a common food in much of the ancient world. Soldiers also relied on beer, which in Mesopotamia was safer than water, and often flavored with herbs or honey to make it more palatable. Among the Celts and Germanic tribes, foods carried into battle were often rooted in their natural environment. Warriors sometimes marched with smoked meats, dried fruits, and hearty cheeses. But some traditions were unusual. There are accounts of warriors drinking blood mixed with milk before combat, a ritual that symbolized strength and vitality. To modern eyes, such a mixture may seem grotesque, but to them it was a sacred act, a way of consuming the life force of animals and entering battle with renewed ferocity. In China, soldiers carried rations that were practical but often peculiar. Dried rice cakes and salted vegetables were staples, but one of the strangest battlefield foods was brick tea. This was tea compressed into solid blocks, which could be shaved into hot water for a quick drink. Some armies also carried fermented foods like pickled radishes or bean pastes, both for energy and for preventing illness. Another unusual drink was a kind of rice wine diluted with water. Though weaker than the wines of Europe, it still provided warmth and courage. Indian warriors often marched with ghee, clarified butter, which could last long without spoiling, and provided concentrated energy. Some also carried balls of jaggery, a type of unrefined sugar, nuts, and dried fruits. Yet one of the more unusual traditions involved spices. Soldiers sometimes carried pouches of peppercorns or ginger, not just for flavor, but for their believed medicinal power. These were chewed before battle to increase alertness, ward off illness, and invigorate the body. Imagine an Indian warrior chewing fiery black peppercorns as he tightened his grip on his sword, an intense ritual of preparation. Norse warriors, the Vikings, were known for carrying dried fish, particularly stockfish, which could last for months without spoiling. But they also had a reputation for drinking mead, a fermented honey drink, before raids. While not exactly a battlefield ration, it became part of their warrior culture. Some sagas even suggest that warriors believed drinking mead before combat connected them to the gods, fueling them with divine madness and courage. Even more curious are the foods carried by medieval European knights, who, though not ancient in the strictest sense, inherited many traditions. They often carried dried bread and salted meat, but also sugar loaves, which were highly prized and considered almost medicinal. Sugar was so rare and expensive in the early Middle Ages that it was treated less as food and more as a powerful restorative. Knights also carried wine or ale, believing alcohol to be safer than water, though this may have left some less than perfectly steady before battle. The theme across all these cultures is clear. Food and drink were never just physical nourishment. They were symbolic, medicinal, and spiritual. Garlic was protection. Dates were energy. Mead was a link to the divine. And vinegar water, however strange it sounds, was a source of courage. Soldiers believed that what they ate or drank before battle could shape their fate as surely as their weapons or armor. In many ways, these unusual rations remind us that war was not just about steel and blood. It was about spirit, faith, and survival. To carry bread hardened like stone, a pouch of peppercorns, or a jar of thick beer into battle was to carry the strength of culture and tradition, wrapped in the simplest of packages. Section 6. Strange weapons and improvised objects. When we imagine ancient battles, we often think of gleaming swords, sturdy shields, and sharp spears raised against the horizon. Yet not every soldier went into combat equipped with finely crafted weapons. Many carried objects that, to us, would seem almost laughably improvised, bizarrely symbolic, or strikingly impractical. These unusual tools and weapons reveal a fascinating truth. War was as much about creativity and symbolism as it was about brute force. Let us begin with the farmers turned soldiers, for in many parts of the world, peasants were pressed into service whenever their rulers needed an army. Without access to fine weaponry, they carried what they knew: farming tools. In ancient China, men often fought with sharpened hoes, flails, or scythes, a wooden threshing tool designed to separate grain could become a brutal bludgeon in the heat of combat. Similarly, in Europe, peasant levies sometimes marched with pitchforks and sickles. These were hardly ideal weapons, but they symbolized resilience, ordinary life twisted into something violent out of necessity. Then there were the unusual projectiles. In Greece, beyond the javelins and arrows, soldiers sometimes hurled sling stones carved with messages or symbols. Archaeologists have uncovered stones inscribed with insults like "take this" or "catch," a grim form of ancient psychological warfare. Roman soldiers also carried lead sling bullets shaped like almonds, sometimes inscribed with curses against the enemy. These small objects, easily overlooked, could pierce armor and bone, and yet they carried the voice of the soldier himself, thrown across the battlefield. The Egyptians, inventive in so many aspects of life, had their own peculiar weapon, the throwing stick. Unlike a spear, it was curved and could be hurled to stun or kill birds, and, by extension, enemies. It resembled a boomerang in shape, though it did not return. Some soldiers carried them alongside bows, believing them useful in both hunting and war. Imagine stepping onto a battlefield where soldiers carried not only arrows, but also these odd curved sticks, half toy, half weapon. In India, warriors sometimes carried urumi, a weapon that seems almost unreal. It was a long, flexible sword, more like a metal whip than a blade, that could wrap around shields or limbs, cutting as it coiled. Difficult to master and wildly dangerous even to its wielder, the urumi was as much a test of skill as it was a tool of war. Soldiers carried them as both weapon and statement. Mastery of such a strange and deadly tool inspired fear before a single strike was made. The Romans too had their share of oddities. One curious object carried by legionaries was the pila muralia, a sharpened wooden stake. At first glance, it looked like little more than a fence post. Yet, soldiers carried them during marches, using them to build temporary fortifications at night. In desperate moments, however, these stakes could be driven into the ground as obstacles or even used as improvised spears. While not glamorous, they reflected Rome's genius for practicality. Every object had more than one purpose. Among the Celts, weaponry often blurred the line between the functional and the symbolic. Some carried swords, far too long and heavy for efficient fighting, seemingly designed to intimidate rather than strike. Others wielded massive horns or carried animal bones into battle, not as weapons in themselves, but as psychological tools to terrify enemies. Warriors might bang antlers together, howl like wolves, or blow great horns to create a wall of sound before charging. The weapons, in this case, were not only metal, but atmosphere, tools of fear. The Norse warriors, too, often used whatever was at hand. While axes are rightly famous as their chosen weapon, they sometimes carried hammers, fishing spears, or even carpenter's tools onto the battlefield. For them, a tool was always a potential weapon. And their adaptability reflected a culture where war was an extension of daily survival. A Viking might use the same axe to chop wood, craft a home, and defend his life. This practical approach gave their armies a strange, unpredictable quality. In Japan, long before the samurai perfected their elegant swords, peasants pressed into service, carried weapons born of farming. The kama, a hand sickle, became a weapon of choice. The nunchaku, originally a flail for threshing rice, was used in training and sometimes in combat. Even the bow staff, a long pole, began as a tool for carrying buckets across shoulders. When needed, each became a weapon of improvisation. Humble origins transformed into martial arts. But some of the strangest weapons carried were not tools at all, but objects of ritual. In some African kingdoms, warriors carried carved staffs or symbolic weapons into battle, designed not for fighting, but for channeling ancestral power. These objects were talismans as much as arms, meant to assure victory through spiritual favor. Similarly, among the Aztecs, some soldiers carried obsidian mirrors or feathered staffs. These were dazzling to behold, meant to reflect sunlight and overwhelm the enemy's senses before combat even began. Even stranger, in moments of desperation, soldiers sometimes carried food as weapons. Accounts exist of ancient Chinese soldiers hurling hard, stale bread at enemies when weapons ran short. In medieval sieges, defenders flung beehives or pots filled with scorpions. Though not handheld weapons in the usual sense, these odd objects reveal a timeless truth. When survival was at stake, creativity often mattered more than steel. Taken together, these strange weapons and improvised tools remind us that ancient warfare was never just about armies marching in perfect formation with identical swords. It was about people, farmers, hunters, craftsmen, thrust into extraordinary circumstances, carrying with them whatever could protect or empower them. A stick, a stone with an insult carved into it, or even a sickle meant for cutting grain, could become the lifeline between life and death. War, in this sense, was as much about imagination as it was about skill, and it is perhaps in these unusual improvised objects that we glimpse the most human side of battle. Soldiers not as distant heroes in polished armor, but as people adapting, surviving, and carrying with them the strange weight of necessity. Section 7. Charms, Amulets, and the Magic of Protection. When we picture the battlefield, our minds often drift to helmets, shields, and armor. Solid, tangible protections forged by smiths. Yet for many ancient soldiers, the most important kind of defense could not be seen at all. It came in the form of charms, amulets, and sacred objects carried close to the body. These were not just decorations. They were believed to be shields woven from faith, superstition, and hope. For the soldier who carried them, survival was as much a matter of spiritual protection as it was of sharpened steel. In ancient Rome, legionaries often carried small figurines of household gods, called lares or penates. These tiny tokens connected them to home, family, and divine guardianship. Imagine a soldier marching far from Italy into the forests of Germania, carrying in his pouch a little bronze figure no bigger than a thumb. To him, that charm wasn't just symbolic. It was his tether to safety, a whisper of home in a strange and dangerous land. Some soldiers even had amulets carved with images of Hercules or Mars, believing the god's strength would flow into their own arms. The Egyptians, as one might expect from a people so immersed in ritual and the afterlife, carried an extraordinary array of protective items. Scarab amulets carved from stone or faience, were believed to ward off evil and bring rebirth. Soldiers wore them on cords around the neck or tucked them under armor. Others carried small carvings of the Eye of Horus, thought to guard against injury and restore health. Some amulets were even inscribed with spells, designed to confuse enemies or keep arrows from striking true. To an Egyptian soldier, the battlefield was not just a physical struggle, but a contest between spiritual forces. In Greece, warriors often wore charms inscribed with protective words or images. One popular design was the Gorgonian, the fearsome face of Medusa. Soldiers believed that her petrifying gaze, even in symbolic form, could ward off harm. Shields and breastplates sometimes bore her likeness, but many men also wore smaller pendants tucked beneath their clothing. There are stories, too, of Greek warriors carrying knotted cords blessed by priests, each knot representing a prayer for survival. In their minds, every thread bound them closer to divine protection. Among the Celts, charms were often drawn from the natural world. Warriors wore animal teeth, claws, or bones, believing they inherited the strength of the creature. A bear's tooth might grant ferocity. A wolf's claw might grant cunning. Some painted their bodies with blue woad, not only as a symbol of fearlessness, but as a magical charm against death. Druids were said to bless certain stones or wooden carvings, which warriors carried into battle with equal confidence as they did their spears. For the Vikings and Norsemen, runes played a central role. Warriors carved runic inscriptions onto weapons, shields, and even their skin, believing these symbols carried magical protection. The Algiz rune, shaped like a protective figure with arms raised, was particularly popular as a charm against harm. Some carried Thor's hammer pendants, calling on the god to protect them in the chaos of war. In the sagas, there are tales of warriors inscribing entire spells on bones or bits of wood, carried as talismans to ward off blades. For these soldiers, magic and battle were inseparable. In Mesopotamia, soldiers sometimes carried clay tablets etched with protective prayers or symbols, tiny enough to be slipped into a pouch or hung around the neck. These tablets invoked gods such as Ninurta, the warrior deity. Some even bore the image of Pazuzu, a demon figure who paradoxically was thought to repel worse demons. To march with such an amulet was to walk beneath an unseen shield, one that arrows could not pierce. Even in China, amulets played a powerful role. Soldiers carried jade discs, believed to preserve the soul and strengthen the body. Others wore coins strung on cords, marked with inscriptions against misfortune. Some warriors even carried strips of paper with protective spells written in calligraphy, tucked into armor like secret guardians. Taoist priests sometimes blessed amulets before a campaign, assuring soldiers that they carried a piece of cosmic order with them into the disorder of war. For medieval knights in Europe, charms blended with Christian faith. Soldiers often carried small crosses, relics, or pieces of saints' bones, sewn into pouches. Crusaders in particular prized such relics, believing them to be more powerful than any armor. Some knights carried parchments with prayers inscribed upon them, sealed inside lockets. Others pinned small tokens given by loved ones, ribbons, rings, or miniature portraits, onto their clothing, believing that love itself was a form of divine shield. But not all protective charms were so formal or sacred. Many soldiers carried personal keepsakes that, to them, held magical weight. A lock of a wife's hair, a child's drawing, a small stone from home. All these became talismans in their own way. The belief was simple, but profound. If I carry a piece of home, I will surely return to it. These tokens might not have been blessed by priest or shaman, but they carried power in the soldier's heart. Interestingly, protective charms were not only about survival, but also about courage. A soldier who believed himself shielded by divine favor or ancestral power could fight more boldly, with less fear. That confidence itself was a kind of armor. To march into the chaos of battle, clutching a charm that whispered, "You will not die today," was a way to transform terror into strength. When we look at these ancient charms and amulets, we see more than superstition. We see the deep human need to find meaning, safety, and connection in the most dangerous of moments. Steel may break, shields may splinter, but belief in a charm's power, in a god's protection, in the love of family waiting at home, was a shield no weapon could shatter. In the end, the most powerful thing soldiers carried into battle was not always forged of bronze or iron, but of faith, and in that faith, they found the courage to face the unthinkable. Section 8. Strange animals in the midst of battle. When we imagine an army on the move, we often think of rows of soldiers, the rumble of wagons, and perhaps the thunder of horses. But ancient armies often carried with them more than weapons and warriors. They brought animals, not only horses, mules, or camels used for transport, but stranger companions, creatures chosen for symbolism, superstition, or sheer oddity. To the ancient soldier, these animals could represent power, courage, and divine favor, or in some cases they were practical allies in unexpected ways. Perhaps the most unusual example comes from the Egyptians, who revered certain animals as sacred to their gods. Cats, for instance, were considered symbols of protection. Some soldiers are believed to have carried images of cats or even live cats into conflict, hoping that their presence would invoke divine guardianship. In fact, during the Persian invasion of Egypt in the 6th century BCE, the Persian king Cambyses II reportedly used this belief against them. His troops painted cats on their shields and even drove live cats and other sacred animals toward the Egyptian lines, knowing the Egyptians would hesitate to strike. Whether every detail of this story is true or not, it reveals the weight animals held in ancient minds, not as mere beasts, but as conduits of fate. The Romans, pragmatic as they often were, also carried unusual creatures into war. They used dogs not just as guards, but as companions, sometimes outfitting them with spiked collars to harass enemies in the chaos of battle. More curiously, there are accounts of soldiers carrying sacred chickens into campaigns. These were not mascots in the modern sense. They were oracles. Before battle, Roman priests would scatter grain before the chickens. If the birds ate eagerly, the omen was good. If they refused to eat, it was a warning to delay or prepare for defeat. Imagine a seasoned centurion glancing anxiously at a chicken pecking at grain before ordering thousands of men into combat. It may sound absurd, yet to Roman soldiers, those chickens were the very voice of the gods. In India, elephants were famously used as living weapons, towering beasts that could terrify enemies simply by appearing on the battlefield. Yet elephants were also decorated with charms and painted symbols, transforming them into both war engines and sacred protectors. Beyond elephants, some soldiers carried monkeys as mascots, believing them to be omens of cleverness and agility. In Hindu tradition, the monkey god Hanuman was a symbol of courage and devotion, so carrying such an animal might have felt like bringing a divine ally into battle. The Celts, too, were known for unusual animal companions. They often brought hunting dogs into conflict, but some accounts suggest warriors also carried small birds, such as ravens, as omens of victory or death. In Celtic mythology, ravens were closely linked with the gods of war and fate. To see a raven circling above the battlefield was thought to be a sign that the gods themselves were watching. Some warriors even kept tame ravens, believing the birds whispered messages from the other world. The Persians are said to have used camels in ways that startled their enemies. Not only did they serve as beasts of burden, but camels were sometimes driven toward opposing cavalry, whose horses would panic at the unfamiliar smell. In a sense, the camels became living weapons, though they were not trained to fight. To soldiers marching alongside them, camels represented both practicality and cunning, a reminder that war could be won with wit as much as steel. Even the Greeks, usually so logical in their strategies, carried unusual animals into their campaigns. Pythagorean philosophers within the army sometimes encouraged the carrying of snakes or frogs, symbols of transformation and renewal. While these may not have marched into the front lines, they were present in camps, guarded carefully in jars or baskets. For the men who carried them, these creatures were not pests, but sacred allies, embodying the cycles of life, death, and rebirth. One of the strangest animal-related practices comes from China, where some armies are said to have used geese and roosters as living alarm systems. Their sharp cries warned of intruders in the night, protecting soldiers from surprise attacks. At the same time, roosters carried spiritual significance. Their crowing at dawn was associated with dispelling evil spirits. To a weary soldier, far from home, the crow of a rooster at sunrise might have been more comforting than the clang of any bell. In medieval Europe, knights and men-at-arms sometimes carried falcons into campaigns. While primarily symbols of prestige and hunting prowess, falcons also served as omens. A falcon that returned swiftly from flight was a good sign. One that faltered could cast a shadow over the day. Some nobles even kept exotic animals in their retinues, lions, leopards, or bears, not as practical warriors, but as living displays of wealth and divine favor. To march beside such creatures must have felt like stepping into a myth. Perhaps the most touching use of animals in war was as companions of comfort. Soldiers often carried small pets, dogs, birds, even mice, not for omens or tactics, but for a sense of normalcy. In the loneliness of campaign life, a loyal animal offered solace, a living link to gentler days. While history remembers the great beasts and their symbolic weight, these small companions remind us that soldiers were still human, longing for companionship even amid the roar of battle. Looking back, these stories of animals in war may strike us as bizarre, even absurd. Yet behind them lies something deeply human. Soldiers, facing the terror of combat, sought strength wherever they could find it. In gods, in charms, in omens, and in the loyal gaze of an animal at their side. To carry such a creature into battle was not only to carry a symbol of faith, but to carry courage itself. Section 9. Unusual foods, drinks, and potions soldiers relied on. When soldiers marched off to war, they carried not only their weapons and armor, but also something far more basic: sustenance. Yet the meals and drinks ancient warriors brought with them were often far from ordinary. In a world where the line between medicine, ritual, and food was blurred, what one soldier swallowed for strength might have looked to us more like a bizarre potion than a meal. And in those desperate moments before battle, when fear was thick in the air, consuming something believed to grant courage, vitality, or divine favor could feel as important as wielding a sword. The Romans were perhaps the most systematic in their approach to army rations, yet even they carried curious foods. A standard Roman soldier might be issued bread, cheese, and vinegar mixed with water, a sour drink called posca. While it may sound unpleasant, posca was thought to purify water, stave off disease, and refresh the body under the blazing Mediterranean sun. But beyond the basics, many soldiers also carried lucky morsels. Some would tuck dried figs into their belts, not only as a convenient snack, but also because figs were linked to fertility and divine favor. Eating them before combat was thought to draw strength from the gods themselves. In Greece, warriors relied on a simple yet powerful food: barley mash. Thick and filling, it sustained soldiers during long campaigns. But Greeks also valued honey as a sacred food. Some soldiers carried small jars of honeycomb, not only for nourishment, but also for its symbolic connection to purity and immortality. Honey, in their minds, was a substance that did not decay, a food of the gods. To taste it before battle was to take in a spark of divinity. There are even accounts of Greek soldiers consuming honey mixed with wine in the days before combat, a ritual that blurred the line between feast and sacrament. The Celts, fierce warriors of the forests and fields of Europe, had their own strange food rituals. They brewed strong, fermented drinks from grains and honey, and some accounts suggest that warriors would drink heavily before charging into battle. This was not mere recklessness. Many believed the drink filled them with a divine madness, a battle frenzy known as the berserker's rage. For the Celts, what they consumed was not just fuel. It was a potion of transformation, turning an ordinary man into something fierce and otherworldly. In India, soldiers sometimes carried small bundles of spices and herbs. Turmeric, black pepper, and ginger were valued not only for flavor, but for their supposed medicinal and protective qualities. Mixed into drinks or chewed raw, they were thought to strengthen the body and guard against illness. Ancient texts even describe warriors consuming ghee, clarified butter, before setting out for war, as it was believed to kindle an inner fire, both physical and spiritual. To carry a pouch of spices into battle was to carry the blessings of Ayurveda, the ancient science of life. Meanwhile, Persian soldiers were known for their reliance on dates. Sweet, nourishing, and lightweight, dates were perfect for long marches. But more intriguingly, Persian warriors sometimes carried dried pomegranate seeds as charms and snacks. The pomegranate, with its many seeds, symbolized abundance and eternal life. To chew those seeds on the eve of battle was to taste victory in advance. Some warriors also mixed their water with rose petals or saffron, turning a humble drink into a fragrant ritual of courage. The Chinese armies drew upon a deep tradition of herbal medicine. Soldiers often carried packets of dried roots and leaves, such as ginseng, which was believed to restore vitality and sharpen the mind. In times of weakness, a soldier might brew a quick infusion from these herbs, trusting in their energy. There are even records of soldiers consuming deer antler powder, thought to enhance strength and endurance. For the Chinese warrior, food and medicine were inseparable, and each bite or sip could hold spiritual as well as physical power. Among the Norse and Germanic tribes, food was often less about health and more about ritual. Warriors sometimes fasted before battle, believing hunger sharpened their senses. Others ate meat, sacrificed to the gods, hoping to absorb the power of the animal. There are tales of warriors consuming bear meat or drinking bear blood, believing it would imbue them with the animal's strength and ferocity. To us, it might seem unsettling, but to them it was a sacred communion, a way of binding themselves to the wild power of nature. Perhaps the strangest consumable carried into war was opium and other intoxicating substances. In some parts of the ancient Near East, soldiers used opium before battle, dulling fear and pain while filling them with unnatural courage. In other regions, warriors consumed mushrooms believed to induce visions or madness, drawing them closer to the gods while unmooring them from earthly fear. These substances blurred the line between food, drug, and divine ritual. To march into battle under their influence was to step into another reality altogether. Even the humblest of items could take on deep meaning. A dried crust of bread might be kissed like a charm before being eaten. A sip of wine could be poured onto the ground as an offering to the gods before a soldier drank the rest. These small rituals turned everyday nourishment into sacred acts, binding the soldier not just to his comrades, but to the unseen forces believed to govern fate. What stands out across all these cultures is not just the strangeness of the foods themselves, but the beliefs behind them. A simple date, a jar of honey, a sip of sour vinegar water. Each carried layers of symbolism, faith, and courage. For the ancient soldier, these were not just rations. They were talismans of survival, the reminders that even in the chaos of war, the gods, the earth, and the spirits of animals and plants were with them. And so, as we look back, we realize that food in the ancient battlefield was never just about the stomach. It was about the heart, the soul, and the fragile human need to believe in something greater when facing death. Section 10. Charms, amulets, and magical objects soldiers trusted. Beyond swords, shields, and armor, many ancient soldiers felt they needed another kind of protection, the unseen kind. Steel could guard the body, but charms, amulets, and magical objects were thought to guard the soul. Across cultures, soldiers tucked tiny objects into their belts, tied them around their necks, or even stitched them into their clothing. Each item held symbolic meaning, a whisper of hope against the chaos of the battlefield. In ancient Rome, one of the most common charms was the phallus amulet, known as the fascinum. To modern eyes, it might seem humorous or even crude, but to Romans it symbolized fertility, strength, and warding off evil. Soldiers would wear miniature versions made of bronze or bone, convinced it could protect them from curses and bring good fortune. Alongside these, some Roman soldiers carried small figurines of gods like Mars, the god of war, or Fortuna, the goddess of luck. These charms were not meant to replace skill or strategy, but rather to tilt fate just slightly in the soldier's favor. In Greece, amulets were often crafted with inscriptions or carved with symbols of the gods. Soldiers sometimes wore stones etched with the owl of Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, or carried small bronze figurines of Zeus. One particularly fascinating Greek charm was the gorgoneion, a medallion engraved with the terrifying face of Medusa. The idea was that Medusa's petrifying gaze would symbolically turn away enemies or evil spirits. A soldier might wear it around his neck or engrave the image into his shield. For the Greeks, symbols carried immense weight, and to have such an image close at hand was to carry a sliver of divine power. The Egyptians, who had long traditions of protective magic, filled their soldiers' kits with charms. Scarab amulets, shaped like beetles, were believed to bring renewal and rebirth. Soldiers also carried ankhs, the symbol of eternal life, as tokens against death. More elaborate charms were inscribed with prayers or spells, often invoking the protection of gods like Horus or Sekhmet. To march into battle with one of these charms was to believe that a god's hand hovered close by, ready to shield the warrior from harm. The Celts and Germanic tribes often carried charms made of natural materials, animal teeth, bones, or feathers. A wolf tooth might be worn around the neck to absorb the animal's cunning and ferocity. Raven feathers, linked to the god Odin, were thought to grant foresight and wisdom in battle. Warriors might tie these feathers to their helmets, letting them flutter as a sign that the gods were watching. Some even carried small pouches of soil from their homeland, believing it connected them to their ancestors and kept them safe wherever they went. In China, charms often took the form of jade pendants. Jade was considered a stone of purity and protection, thought to guard against evil and promote health. Soldiers wore discs or small carvings, sometimes shaped like dragons, to call upon strength and courage. Inscriptions were also common, with charms engraved with blessings or auspicious symbols like the tiger, an emblem of bravery and ferocity. Alongside these, some Chinese warriors carried small slips of bamboo inscribed with protective spells, tucked into armor like secret shields against misfortune. Among Persian soldiers, amulets reflected their deep ties to Zoroastrianism. Soldiers sometimes carried small firestones, believed to represent the sacred flame of Ahura Mazda, the supreme god. Others wore discs engraved with sun symbols, linking them to divine light and truth. There are even accounts of warriors wearing charms made of turquoise, a stone believed to protect the wearer from harm and grant victory. These objects were not seen as mere trinkets, but as extensions of cosmic order, a way of ensuring the soldier fought on the side of truth and justice. One of the most curious traditions comes from Mesopotamia, where soldiers believed strongly in the power of protective figurines called apotropaic idols. Tiny clay figures of protective spirits, half lion, half human beings called lamassu, might be carried in a pouch or placed in a soldier's kit. These figures were thought to repel demons and shield the warrior from invisible forces on the battlefield. Alongside them, inscribed tablets with protective prayers were sometimes worn as pendants, serving as both physical and spiritual armor. Even the Norse warriors, known for their fearsome reputation, relied on charms. Many carried small Thor's hammer pendants, invoking the protection of the thunder god. Some carried runestones carved with magical inscriptions. These runes, simple yet powerful symbols, were believed to shape fate itself. To carve a rune into one's weapon or wear it around one's neck was to bind oneself to cosmic forces far greater than steel. Sometimes charms were intensely personal. A soldier might carry a lock of hair from his wife, a small carved token from his child, or even a pebble from a sacred place back home. These were not merely sentimental, they were talismans of connection, reminders of what was worth fighting for. Belief gave them power, and power gave courage. The variety of charms across cultures reveals something deeply human: the need for reassurance in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. War was terrifying, chaotic, and unpredictable. A sword could break, a shield could shatter, but a charm, small, secret, and close to the heart, felt unbreakable. Whether it was a beetle carved from stone, a tooth strung on a cord, or a rune etched into wood, each object held meaning. Each one told a soldier, "You are not alone. The gods, the spirits, your ancestors, they march with you." And so, as we look back, these tiny objects, often overlooked in the great stories of battles and empires, remind us of the human need for faith. In the end, it wasn't only about what could cut or block an enemy's blade. It was about what could calm the mind and steady the heart when stepping into the storm of war. Section 11. Musical instruments and sound makers in battle. While swords, shields, and armor are what we usually imagine when we think of soldiers, ancient warriors often carried objects that made sound. Music and noise had a surprisingly important role in battles. Drums, horns, bells, and other instruments were not just for entertainment. They helped armies coordinate, signal commands, and sometimes even intimidate the enemy. In ancient Rome, soldiers carried the tuba, a long, straight bronze horn. This was very different from our modern trumpet. The tuba's sound was deep and piercing, and it could be heard over the noise of thousands of men moving and shouting. Signals played on the tuba indicated when to advance, retreat, or regroup. Another Roman instrument was the cornu, a large curved horn that could reach a remarkable volume. It had a coil shape and was often carried on a soldier's shoulder. Both tuba and cornu were essential in keeping order during battle. Without them, armies risked confusion and chaos. The Greeks also used sound to control their soldiers. The aulos, a double reed pipe, was played in rhythmic patterns to coordinate marching and attacks. Ancient texts describe soldiers stepping in time with the music, almost like a giant moving organism. It is said that hearing the aulos gave soldiers a sense of unity and purpose, helping them keep formation even under pressure. The sound of multiple pipes together could be haunting and stirring, creating both motivation and calm amid chaos. In China, drums were central to battle. The army drum, or gu, was often large and placed near the commander. Drummers beat steady rhythms to guide troop movements, signal attacks, or announce retreats. Smaller handheld bells or gongs could accompany the drum. Each sound had a specific meaning that soldiers memorized. One might indicate move forward, another circle left, while a different rhythm might call for a defensive stance. Sound gave structure to what would otherwise be a confusing, dangerous battlefield. Egyptian soldiers also made use of music. Ancient reliefs show soldiers carrying small clappers and percussion instruments. Sometimes bronze cymbals or rattles were tied to shields, jingling as soldiers moved. The rhythm could inspire courage or intimidate enemies. Music also carried a ceremonial aspect. Priests sometimes accompanied troops with chants or flutes. invoking the protection of gods before the fighting began. This combined the practical with the spiritual, giving soldiers a sense of safety and purpose. In Mesopotamia, instruments were often used to signal and maintain morale. Small bronze or clay rattles, conch shells, and flutes were portable and could be carried by individual soldiers. Sound could mark the start of an attack or the arrival of reinforcements. Even simple clapping devices were used to set marching pace. It is fascinating to imagine soldiers with swords in one hand and a small musical device in the other, coordinating movement while creating rhythm in the midst of a violent scene. The Celts and Germanic tribes had their own traditions. Horns made from animal horns were common. These horns were often carved or decorated, and their loud, sharp blasts could be heard for miles. Warriors might carry one horn each, blowing together to create an overwhelming sound that unnerved enemies. Some tribes also used rattles or small bells tied to armor. The jingling could confuse the enemy while keeping the warriors in rhythm, almost like the battlefield was a moving, noisy dance. Interestingly, Japanese samurai occasionally used drums and horns called horigai. These conch shell horns were sounded with deep, sustained notes. Each note carried a distinct signal, which could communicate commands over great distances. The horigai's echoing sound had a haunting quality, echoing across mountains or plains. It inspired fear in opponents and courage in allies. These instruments were both practical and symbolic, reminding soldiers that they were part of a larger, ordered force. Even medieval European soldiers sometimes used noisemakers. Before battles, trumpeters signaled the start of the fight, and later, horns or bells marked key moments during the engagement. In some cases, musicians rode alongside commanders, their instruments creating a steady rhythm for cavalry charges. The beat helped horses keep pace and soldiers stay organized. Music on the battlefield was a subtle form of strategy, shaping movement and morale without any physical weapon at all. In addition to horns and drums, some soldiers carried unexpected sound-making items for psychological effect. Small rattles, metal clappers, or chains tied to armor could create continuous noise as armies marched. This constant sound could make forces seem larger than they were. Ancient texts tell of armies intentionally making noise to give the impression of overwhelming numbers. A small unit with clever sound makers could trick enemies into retreating. Music and sound also had a personal aspect. Some soldiers carried tiny flutes or whistles, playing them quietly before the battle to calm nerves. These personal instruments were a form of mental preparation, helping warriors center themselves. Rhythm and melody, even in small doses, could steady a shaking hand or focus the mind on the task ahead. The variety of instruments and sound makers across cultures is remarkable. From bronze horns to rattling chains, from flutes to drums, each object had a purpose. Some guided movement, some struck fear, some provided comfort. And sometimes, a simple rhythm was the difference between chaos and cohesion, courage and panic. Soldiers did not only rely on weapons, they relied on sound, music, and ritual to navigate the uncertainty of battle. When we think of warriors, it is easy to picture armor and swords, shields and spears. Yet the soft beating of a drum, the echo of a horn, or the jingle of small bells reminds us that human beings have always used creativity and ritual to face danger. These musical objects, carried quietly in the midst of fear, show how sound could protect, guide, and even heal. if only by bringing calm to the heart of a soldier before the storm. Section 12. Unexpected items for survival and comfort. When we imagine ancient soldiers, we often think of swords, armor, and shields. Yet many warriors carried items that were not weapons at all. These were objects meant to help them survive, find comfort, and endure long marches or harsh campaigns. From simple tools to personal tokens, these items reveal the human side of war, the need for warmth, nourishment, and reassurance in difficult conditions. In ancient Rome, soldiers often carried small cooking utensils, such as bronze pans and spoons. These allowed them to prepare simple meals on the move. Soldiers also carried small flasks or leather bottles for water. Access to clean water was crucial, and the ability to store it safely could mean the difference between life and death. Beyond practicality, these items gave soldiers a sense of normalcy, a small way to maintain routine, even during campaigns. The Greek hoplites sometimes carried flint and tinder in small pouches. Fire was not only for warmth and cooking, but also for morale. Lighting a small flame at night could provide comfort, a sense of security, and a way to signal others. Some soldiers carried small cloth or leather coverings to shield themselves from rain or cold winds. These simple items were crucial on long marches or during sieges, when exposure could be as dangerous as the enemy. Egyptian soldiers had items that were both practical and symbolic. Small amulets or charms, which we have mentioned before, could be tucked alongside practical tools like knives, water containers, or food pouches. Some carried bread wrapped in cloth or small bundles of dried meat, ensuring a basic meal during extended campaigns. These items were often carried in leather satchels, which were sturdy and portable. For soldiers, being able to eat and stay hydrated, even minimally, was critical for endurance. In China, soldiers often carried bamboo containers for rice and water. Small utensils were included for eating on the move. Additionally, some soldiers carried herbal remedies or medicinal powders to treat minor injuries or prevent illness. The harsh realities of ancient warfare meant that wounds and sickness were common, and being able to manage them without a physician could be life-saving. Small herbal bundles were sometimes tied to belts, within easy reach in case of injury. Persian warriors carried similar survival tools, including small knives, fire-making kits, and containers for water. Some soldiers also carried simple blankets or mats for sleeping. These items provided comfort in the middle of harsh terrain, from deserts to mountains. Comfort items might seem trivial in the context of war, yet they could boost morale and help soldiers recover strength, making them more effective in battle. In Celtic and Germanic armies, soldiers often brought personal items that served both survival and psychological purposes. Animal hides or small mats were used for warmth. Some carried small pouches of salt or preserved meat to ensure they could eat even if foraging failed. Soldiers also brought small tools for making repairs to their gear, such as needles, thread, or small awls. Maintaining armor and clothing was essential, and these tools allowed soldiers to address problems without depending on others. Interestingly, some medieval European soldiers carried grooming items. Small combs, razors, or brushes were included to maintain hygiene during long campaigns. Though they seem trivial, these items helped prevent lice and infections, which could spread rapidly in camps. Even small efforts to stay clean contributed to physical health and mental well-being, which in turn affected performance in battle. Beyond physical survival, soldiers carried items for emotional comfort. Small tokens from home, such as a piece of cloth, a carved figure, or a written note, were tucked into pouches or sewn into clothing. These objects reminded warriors of their families, their villages, and what they were fighting for. In some armies, soldiers carried religious texts or prayers, which provided solace and courage. Such items could transform fear into focus, despair into determination. In Mesopotamia, soldiers sometimes carried tiny pots or flasks containing water or wine. A sip during rest could rejuvenate the body and calm nerves. They also carried small bundles of bread or dried figs, which provided sustenance without requiring cooking. The portability of these items was essential, allowing soldiers to maintain energy while moving through difficult terrain or during long marches. Even Norse warriors included survival tools alongside their weapons. Small flint knives, fire-starting kits, and containers for water or food were common. They also carried simple clothing items to protect against rain and cold, such as woolen wraps or cloaks. These items provided comfort, helping soldiers endure harsh Scandinavian weather and long journeys. The combination of practical tools and personal tokens shows how soldiers prepared for more than just combat. They anticipated fatigue, hunger, exposure, and illness. A small knife, a bundle of herbs, or a familiar charm could save life, body, and mind. Carrying these objects required foresight and discipline, yet it also reveals the deeply human side of soldiers, the desire for safety, nourishment, and a touch of home, even in the chaos of war. In every culture, soldiers adapted their packs to meet practical and psychological needs. Ancient warfare was unpredictable and dangerous. But these seemingly ordinary items gave warriors the resources to survive, to stay comfortable, and to remain brave. A tiny tool or a familiar token could make a harsh march feel manageable, provide small moments of calm, and prepare the soldier for whatever came next. Even in a world dominated by swords and shields, these objects remind us that survival and comfort were essential parts of battle. The human mind and body needed support as much as the body needed armor. These items were not glamorous, but they were vital. They tell a story of adaptation, resilience, and the quiet ingenuity of those who faced danger with nothing but courage and the small items they carried into the storm. Section 13. Personal items for morale, superstition, and daily life. In addition to weapons, armor, and survival tools, ancient soldiers often carried items for personal comfort, morale, and superstition. These objects were not strictly practical, but they played an important role in helping warriors cope with the stresses of battle. From charms to small keepsakes, these personal items provided reassurance, focus, and sometimes even a sense of luck. In ancient Rome, many soldiers carried amulets or small charms known as bulla. These were thought to offer protection against evil spirits and danger. The soldiers often wore them around the neck or tied them to their belts. These small objects were believed to ward off harm and bring good fortune in combat. Some soldiers also carried small carved figures of gods or goddesses. These served as personal reminders of divine support and offered comfort in tense situations. Greek warriors also valued personal items for morale. Soldiers sometimes carried tiny figurines of deities such as Athena or Apollo. These figurines could be tucked into armor or kept in small pouches. Greek soldiers also sometimes inscribed short prayers or symbols on pieces of clay or metal. Touching these objects before battle provided reassurance, a sense of continuity, and a reminder of their faith. These items were portable, personal, and special and powerful in a psychological sense. Egyptian soldiers often brought small statuettes, charms, or amulets engraved with protective symbols. Some carried scarabs, which were symbols of rebirth and regeneration. Soldiers believed that these objects could shield them from harm and guide them safely through combat. In addition, some carried personal mementos from home, such as pieces of cloth, small tokens from family members, or other sentimental items. These objects helped maintain a sense of identity and connection, even in foreign lands or on distant battlefields. In China, soldiers sometimes carried jade amulets or small carvings believed to attract good fortune and prevent injury. Small figurines or charms might be worn on belts or carried in pouches. Superstition played a major role in soldier morale, as warriors relied on these objects for reassurance. Even items that seem trivial today, such as a simple charm or token, could have a significant effect on a soldier's confidence and courage. Persian soldiers also carried personal talismans, including small charms engraved with sacred symbols. These were often paired with practical items like water flasks or knives. Soldiers believed that these talismans could protect them from injury or illness. They also carried small keepsakes from home, reminding them of family, village, or loved ones. Such objects strengthened emotional resilience, making soldiers more willing to face danger. In Celtic and Germanic armies, soldiers were known to carry unusual personal items. Some carried small stones, feathers, or animal teeth, believed to bring strength or courage. Others had tiny figurines or carvings of animals that represented power, protection, or wisdom. Warriors might clutch these items in battle, or keep them close in pouches. Each object had a symbolic meaning, often linked to the natural world or ancestral beliefs. Medieval European soldiers frequently used personal objects for luck and morale. Soldiers carried small crosses, religious tokens, or saint medals. Some had sewn tiny charms into clothing or armor, often inscribed with prayers or protective symbols. Beyond superstition, these items were a source of comfort, reminding soldiers of home and faith. Even small touches of familiarity could ease stress, improve focus, and strengthen courage during long campaigns. Interestingly, some soldiers carried writing materials as personal items. Ancient Romans, for example, sometimes brought wax tablets or small pieces of parchment. Soldiers could write notes to loved ones, keep records of provisions, or even jot down personal reflections. These items allowed them to maintain a sense of normal life amid the chaos of war. Writing provided mental comfort, focus, and a link to the world beyond the battlefield. Some armies included small games or recreational items. Soldiers carried dice, small boards, or pieces for simple games. These items were not weapons, but they helped pass the time during long marches or periods of waiting. Playing a game could relieve stress, build camaraderie, and maintain mental sharpness. It was a quiet form of self-care, ensuring that soldiers stayed alert and connected even in the midst of conflict. Food and drink could also serve as personal comfort items. In addition to standard rations, some soldiers carried small treats or spices from home. A piece of dried fruit, a few nuts, or a pinch of special seasoning could lift spirits, create a sense of normalcy, and even foster a moment of calm in tense circumstances. These items were small but psychologically significant, helping soldiers maintain morale during long campaigns. Across cultures, these personal objects show that soldiers prepared not only for battle, but for the human experience of war. Carrying talismans, charms, keepsakes, writing materials, or games gave warriors control over aspects of their lives they could influence. They created pockets of comfort, reassurance, and meaning amidst the unpredictability and danger of battle. Even in armies dominated by weaponry and strategy, these small items reveal a deeply human side of soldiers. They remind us that courage is not only physical, but emotional. A charm, a note, or a tiny figurine could strengthen resolve, focus attention, and provide a quiet sense of security. Soldiers were not merely fighters. They were human beings facing fear, relying on small objects to protect, comfort, and guide them through the uncertainties of war. Through these personal items, we glimpse the everyday humanity of ancient warriors. Beyond swords, shields, and armor, the objects soldiers carried for morale and superstition reveal a universal need for reassurance, comfort, and connection. These objects were quietly powerful, shaping courage, focus, and resilience long before the clash of battle ever began. Section 14. Decorative and symbolic items, status, allegiance, and intimidation. Ancient soldiers did more than just fight. They carried objects that displayed status, allegiance, and sometimes even intimidation. These items were carefully chosen to communicate identity, role, and loyalty within an army. Beyond functionality, they served social and psychological purposes, shaping the perception of the soldier both to allies and enemies. In ancient Rome, some soldiers carried small banners or insignias on their armor. These symbols identified their legion and rank. The decorations could be intricate, made of metal or fabric, and often included embossed designs or painted motifs. Soldiers also carried personal badges or medallions that signified military honors or commendations. These items boosted morale and conveyed prestige, allowing the soldier to feel recognized and valued within the larger structure of the army. Greek hoplites, similarly, decorated their shields and helmets with symbols representing city-states or family heritage. A lion, an owl, or an abstract design could indicate affiliation, bravery, or lineage. These designs were not just artistic. They communicated allegiance and inspired comrades while intimidating opponents. Some warriors carried small emblems or charms affixed to their belts or armor, believed to invoke courage or divine favor. In Egypt, soldiers sometimes adorned themselves with jewelry, beads, or small ornamental objects. These items could indicate status, role, or connection to a particular temple or deity. Some decorations were symbolic, such as miniature ankhs or scarabs, which reinforced identity and spiritual protection. Soldiers often wore these items proudly, not only for personal belief, but to signal their position and reliability within the ranks. Chinese soldiers in ancient dynasties carried small engraved pendants or symbols on belts and armor. The decorations might indicate rank, clan affiliation, or accomplishments. Certain colors, shapes, or materials were reserved for specific roles, creating a visual hierarchy on the battlefield. Beyond status, some items were designed to intimidate opponents. For example, reflective surfaces or ornate helmets could dazzle and distract enemies while signaling discipline and cohesion. Persian warriors often used decorative motifs to show loyalty to their king or regional commander. They carried insignias, metal badges, or patterned sashes that communicated their place within the military structure. Some soldiers carried small, ornate weapons with engraved handles, which were not just practical but symbolic. These symbols reinforced hierarchy, loyalty, and pride, giving soldiers a tangible representation of their role and achievements. Celtic and Germanic warriors frequently used painted or carved symbols on shields, helmets, and belts. Animal motifs, such as wolves or eagles, were common, signifying strength and courage. Warriors might also carry amulets or charms bearing tribal symbols. These items not only demonstrated allegiance, but also boosted morale and intimidated enemies with their striking appearance. A bold design could make a small group of warriors seem larger or more threatening than they were. In medieval Europe, soldiers often carried banners, pennants, and heraldic symbols. Knights displayed coats of arms on shields, tunics, and surcoats. Even smaller soldiers or auxiliaries might wear armbands, colored cords, or embroidered symbols to indicate loyalty. Decorative items help prevent confusion during battle, showing who belonged to which faction. They also reminded soldiers of the honor and prestige tied to their role, reinforcing courage and commitment. Some armies included subtle psychological decorations. In Roman legions, soldiers sometimes carried small metal decorations that clinked when moving. This subtle sound could coordinate marching, create a sense of cohesion, and intimidate approaching enemies. Soldiers also painted or etched symbols on their armor to inspire fear. These visual and auditory cues reinforced the perception of organization, skill, and strength. Interestingly, some soldiers used personal artistic touches, engraving small designs on belt buckles, weapons, or armor, allowed them to personalize their appearance without breaking regulations. The designs could commemorate past victories, honor a deity, or simply provide aesthetic satisfaction. Even these small decorative objects contributed to morale and identity, giving soldiers a quiet sense of pride in their equipment and appearance. Certain items carried ritual significance alongside decorative function. Egyptian soldiers might carry small amulets with engraved symbols of gods, which also served as decoration. Greek soldiers sometimes wore colored ribbons or fabric strips, intended to please the gods or honor the fallen. In this way, decoration, symbolism, and superstition often merged, providing multiple benefits in a single object. Across cultures, decorative items communicated rank, allegiance, and psychological presence. They were more than ornamentation. They were tools for organization, motivation, and intimidation. Soldiers could identify allies quickly, signal strategy, and inspire confidence. At the same time, striking symbols could unnerve enemies, amplify perceived numbers, or instill hesitation. These items created layers of meaning and purpose beyond their physical presence. Even in the chaos of battle, these decorative and symbolic objects helped soldiers maintain structure, identity, and focus. They were reminders of hierarchy, loyalty, and tradition, providing both confidence and clarity. By displaying status and allegiance, soldiers reinforced cohesion within their unit, creating unity that often determined the outcome of engagement. Ultimately, these items show that warfare was not purely physical. The human mind, perception, and symbolism were equally crucial. Decorations communicated power, identity, and resolve. They were small, portable, and often understated, yet they shaped morale, cohesion, and perception in profound ways. A simple pendant, emblem, or painted design could quietly strengthen a soldier's courage, signal loyalty, and influence the psychology of both allies and enemies. These objects reveal the richness and complexity of ancient warfare. Beyond weapons and armor, soldiers thought carefully about the images they projected, the symbols they carried, and the morale they could inspire. Through decoration and symbolism, warriors expressed pride, allegiance, and strategy. The objects were functional, beautiful, and psychologically powerful, weaving a subtle layer of meaning into every march, camp, and battlefield. Section 15. Rare and unexpected items plus outro. Even after centuries of study, historians continue to be surprised by the rare and unusual items that ancient soldiers carried into battle. Beyond weapons, armor, tools, and decorative symbols. Some soldiers brought objects that seem unusual, even whimsical. These items often had personal, symbolic, or practical purposes, reflecting the human need to adapt, protect, and comfort oneself in difficult circumstances. In some armies, soldiers carried musical instruments. Small flutes, drums, or horns could be used to signal commands, maintain marching rhythm, or even inspire courage. Music was a subtle but powerful tool. The familiar sound of a drumbeat or flute could boost morale, steady nerves, and coordinate movements across the battlefield. In addition, soldiers sometimes played quietly during pauses, offering a small measure of calm amidst the tension. Other soldiers carried personal grooming items, such as small combs, brushes, or mirrors. These objects may seem frivolous in the context of war, but they helped maintain hygiene and a sense of normalcy. Even a small gesture, like smoothing one's hair or checking a reflection, could bring comfort and mental clarity. Soldiers often spent long periods in rough conditions, and such items provided a connection to everyday life, reinforcing human dignity in harsh circumstances. Some soldiers carried small containers of perfume, incense, or scented oils. These scents were not intended to impress enemies, but to comfort the soldiers themselves. Fragrant oils could mask unpleasant odors, refresh the senses, and provide a moment of calm. In Roman and Greek armies, soldiers sometimes rubbed oils on their bodies before battle. The ritual itself offered reassurance, a quiet moment of preparation, and a sensory connection to culture and tradition. In addition, soldiers sometimes carried portable writing materials for personal or practical purposes. Wax tablets, small parchments, or pieces of papyrus allowed soldiers to record messages, reflect privately, or track supplies. Writing offered mental focus and a sense of continuity, even in chaotic campaigns. Some soldiers used these items to communicate with loved ones, keeping a tangible link to home and family while far from familiar surroundings. Certain unusual items served protective or superstitious functions. In addition to charms and amulets, some soldiers carried animal bones, teeth, or feathers, believed to attract luck, courage, or strength. These objects might be tucked into belts, helmets, or pockets. Although their practical effect was uncertain, they were psychologically significant. Soldiers believed in the power of symbolism, and carrying these items gave reassurance, boosting confidence when facing danger. Other rare items included small medicinal kits or herbal mixtures. Soldiers carried powders, ointments, or dried herbs that could treat minor wounds, prevent infection, or alleviate fatigue. Ancient armies often faced harsh conditions, and such items could mean the difference between minor discomfort and serious injury. Even if the kits were simple, they represented foresight and self-care, helping soldiers maintain health and stamina over long campaigns. In some cases, soldiers carried tiny tokens from loved ones, such as cloth, jewelry, or carved objects. These items provided emotional support and a reminder of home. Clutching a small keepsake before battle could calm fear, focus the mind, and inspire courage. Emotional resilience was as important as physical readiness, and personal mementos played a quiet but vital role in sustaining morale. Interestingly, some soldiers carried small animals or pets. While uncommon, there are historical accounts of soldiers keeping small birds, rodents, or even tiny dogs. These companions offered comfort, distraction, and a sense of routine. Caring for a small creature provided a brief escape from the rigors of war, helping soldiers retain a connection to life outside the battlefield. Other soldiers carried tools for entertainment, such as small game pieces, dice, or string instruments. During long waits, these items allowed soldiers to relax, bond with comrades, and preserve mental sharpness. Even a simple game could foster camaraderie and alleviate stress. By maintaining morale and focus, these unusual items contributed indirectly to survival and effectiveness. Across civilizations, soldiers also carried items that combined practicality and symbolism. A decorated flask, for example, might hold water, but also display allegiance, honor, or personal belief. A brightly colored ribbon could tie hair, mark rank, and carry symbolic meaning simultaneously. These multi-purpose items reveal the ingenuity of soldiers, blending function, identity, and psychological support in a single object. As we reflect on these rare and unexpected items, it becomes clear that soldiers were human in all their complexity. They prepared for battle not only with weapons and armor, but with comfort, superstition, and personal connection. Each small object, whether a charm, token, instrument, or keepsake, offered reassurance, identity, and a moment of calm in an unpredictable and often dangerous world. Through these rare items, we gain a glimpse into the daily lives of soldiers across time and place. The human need for security, comfort, and emotional connection is evident in every charm, memento, and unusual possession. These objects remind us that even in the harshest circumstances, people seek small ways to preserve dignity, focus, and courage. In conclusion, the odd items carried by ancient soldiers reveal a deeply human story. Beyond strategies, formations, and battles, the personal, decorative, and unusual objects show the ways soldiers coped with fear, fatigue, and uncertainty. They remind us that war is not only a physical challenge, but an emotional and psychological one as well. Small objects could make a profound difference, shaping courage, morale, and resilience. And now, as we slowly come to the end of this exploration, you can let your mind relax. Imagine the soldiers of the past, carrying their unusual, comforting, and sometimes curious items through dusty paths, vast plains, and distant lands. Think of the small charms, mementos, and keepsakes, quietly shaping courage and focus, and guiding them through each day. Take a deep breath and feel a sense of calm, knowing that even in the most challenging circumstances, humans have always found ways to care for themselves, to connect with others, and to find comfort in small objects. Let your thoughts drift gently, like a soldier's hand resting on a charm or a token of home carried close to the heart. Soon, this narration will end. Allow yourself to sink into quiet reflection, releasing any tension. The past has shown us not only battles and bravery, but the small, human ways people sought comfort, reassurance, and courage. Sleep peacefully now, letting the stories of these unusual soldiers and their curious items linger gently in your mind. Good night.